Senator, look, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pretty dynamic conversation here so far, as you've had, I guess, a taste of. And I know as well, Senator, that you've had the opportunity to take a look at the report that the National Security College produced, the reports we produced on community attitudes. Your own work, Senator for Victoria, now the opposition spokesman for Defence, but of course previously Shadow Cabinet Secretary, your service across many portfolios in opposition, but also across really a whole spread of parliamentary committees, and a long time friend and supporter of the National Security College. You're certainly one of those parliamentarians that's been very deeply engaged, including in supporting our own parliamentary program. So I might just begin by getting your own take on what you draw out of our reports, and then I'd love to draw you into a longer conversation.
Well, Rory, thank you so much for having me here. I so admire the work of the National Security College, and it's a special treat to be here with you. It feels like we're filming an episode of Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis. The millennials in the audience will understand what that means. It was a really profound and important piece of research that you did in a conversation you had with the Australian people, and there's a lot of top-line stats that are really interesting and driving the media conversation over the last few days. 2/3 of Australians concerned about national security. Fewer than 20% of Australians think we're adequately prepared for the environment we're in. The one that really stood out to me, though, was 53% of Australians think that government should tell them more about what they know about national security. And that really resonates with me, because I think we've done a disservice to the Australian people in recent years by not being direct and frank with them about the threats that we face. In fact, I think we've done the opposite. We've deliberately tried to reassure people and tell them that everything is fine and it's under control and you're not to worry, or we've deliberately obscured what we mean with incomprehensible language that is inaccessible to normal people, not because they're not intelligent, but because they're busy and they've got other priorities in their lives. And I was personally inspired by a speech that was recently reported by the ABC of the Deputy Chief of Army, Chris Smith, who is exhorting his military colleagues to speak more directly and plainly about what they mean. Why do we say uncertain strategic environment when actually what we mean is dangerous strategic environment? And if that kind of bureaucratic doublespeak is a problem in the military, it's an even bigger problem, frankly, in politics. And so I'm going to try in this role as much as possible to speak directly and plainly to the Australian people without being reckless and alarmist and irresponsible about it.
So let's pick up on that. And I do want to come back to some of the other issues, the issues of security anxiety, the issue of preparedness, and obviously defence itself. But on that communication issue, on the one hand, we got very clear data that a majority of the respondents and majority of the population through our representative survey want government to tell them more about national security risks and threats. Only 4% feel over-informed. But at the same time, in our focus group discussions, when we really drilled down into that with a cross-section of people, they were also clear about the balance to be struck, the importance of panic not arising from some sort of unmanaged dump of information about threats from government. How do you see that balance?
I'm very sensitive to that because we've got dual responsibilities as parliamentarians in public life. I'm a politician. I want my party to win the next election. I've got a political task to communicate to the Australian people why my party would be better at managing national security and defence than any other party. But I've also got a pretty profound responsibility to the national interest, particularly in a national security portfolio. And I have a belief that we're in grave danger of not being able to pass on to future generations a sovereign liberal democracy, and that if we don't pretty radically change our approach to defence and national security, including spending much more than we are now, then we are being reckless with that custodianship and that obligation we have to future generations. So my approach to this portfolio is going to be constructive and bipartisan when it comes to sensitive issues of national security, but not to pull my punches when I think that government is making mistakes or not investing adequately in defence. And if the public knew, even despite the pretty strong figures that you got in your survey, but if the public knew just how likely conflict was in the next few years in our region and how actually ill-prepared the ADF is to fight and survive in that conflict if it happens, let alone hopefully prevent it through deterrence, I think they'd be marching in the streets calling for higher defence spending. They would be really shocked by the state of the readiness of the ADF, and that's no reflection on the incredibly professional men and women who serve in it, but it is a reflection on the way in which Parliament and governments have failed to earn the social licence for why we need higher defence spending so that we are prepared for this incredibly dangerous moment that we're in.
That's a very blunt assessment about the ADF, and particularly coming from the shadow defence position, the shadow defence portfolio. I do want to come back to national preparedness more generally, and not only on the military issues, but I'm actually going to jump into the defence piece right away, if that's okay. So we had here this morning, we obviously had a very good panel just now representing a range of views across Parliament. Prior to that, we had some remarks by your colleague, Andrew Hastie, and he was looking, for example, at some of the war zones in the world, particularly Ukraine, and what the shock and the rupture of conflict is like. I'd be interested in some thoughts from you at this early stage in the portfolio on capability. What do we need that we don't have? What are the lessons that you perhaps are drawing from not only the Ukraine conflict, but of course now the conflict we're seeing in the Middle East over Iran?
Well, happily, I've not yet been briefed to a classified level on our military capabilities, so I'm not constrained in how.
You might get some good news out of that, by the way.
I doubt it. I hope so, but happily, I'm not constrained in just referring to open source reporting of what platforms we have available right now, what our munition stocks are like, and that is that we have far too few surface combatants in the Navy. That the Anzac-class frigates couldn't be safely deployed to a mission in the Middle East if we wanted to, that the air warfare destroyers, which could be probably deployed safely, we may only have one in the water right now, and that's our most exquisite surface combatant capability that we couldn't probably afford just to send to the Middle East, that if a shooting war started that we were involuntarily drawn into or forced to participate in, that we would run out of munitions in a matter of days, if not weeks. I mean, these are alarming, publicly available information about the state of the ADF readiness, and I think most Australians don't really appreciate the full picture of that because they haven't had people plainly and directly explain that to them. And as I said before, if they did have that explanation given to them, I think they would be demanding higher spending on defence, and much more quickly than what the government proposes. I mean, I think it's irresponsible to get a report from people like Sir Angus Houston and Stephen Smith and Professor Peter Dean, that all of whom have publicly since said we need to be spending much faster and much more on defence, and still have defence spending at 2% of GDP 4 years into a new government after they received that report. There's promises of a little bit of defence spending increase in the future, but how on earth, if the environment changes on a dime, which we've learned in Ukraine can happen and which we've learned again in Iran can happen, how on earth would Australia navigate that? How would we defend our northern bases? How would we defend our cities? How would we defend critical infrastructure like ports when we have almost no integrated air and missile defence to protect them? And we are now living in an age of missiles and drones. We should be heeding the lessons of the Ukraine war now 4 years in, and if we hadn't learned those lessons, we should be sure as hell better learn the lessons of Iran.
And part of the answer to that question for decades now has been reliance on the alliance with the United States. So I wonder if you want to expand on any of those points in the alliance context, including in light of the real questions that many are raising about the United States.
I'm a still big believer in the United States and in the Australia-United States alliance and in AUKUS, but I'm also a realist, and I can see what you can all see about the behaviour of the Trump administration. It is unlike any administration which has preceded it, and because it is the Trump administration Mark II, it can't just be dismissed as an aberration of history and a moment of a single presidency, particularly when it looks like that the successors to Trumpism, the inheritors of Trumpism, whether that's J.D. Vance or someone else, are just as fervent believers in the Trump doctrine when it comes to foreign policy and national security as he is, maybe even more authentically believe in what he has argued in recent years. So Australia has to adjust to the reality of that world. It's no longer adequate to just hope that the United States will come to our aid in a time of crisis. We have to both be a better ally for the United States and make a bigger contribution to that alliance by investing more in defence capability. But we also have to prepare for a world where we may have to look after ourselves and fend for ourselves in a region where we're clearly not the predominant power. And what does that mean in practical terms? Well, we need to be investing in much more asymmetric capability, things which a smaller nation can make a larger potential adversary have doubt in their minds about whether they should threaten our interests. And that does look like more missiles and drones and other capabilities like that. When Ukraine, who doesn't have a navy, can sink the Russian Black Sea fleet using cheap drones 3D printed in a factory in the UK in a number of weeks, there is no excuse for Australia not having those capabilities and posing the same dilemmas for our potential adversaries in our region.
Now, we had a very good session of this conference yesterday where we brought 3 economists on stage, economists from very different schools of thought, including across the political spectrum. And we allowed them to ask us the hard questions that we did not ask in our surveys. So we asked public threat perceptions, likelihood, consequence. There's a risk matrix there which we can come back to later because it actually was quite stark. We didn't ask the question, so what are you willing to forego? Are you willing to see taxes raised? Are you willing to see other good things, other expectations in the economy foregone for the increased defence spending that we need? So I am interested in your addressing that, Senator, but also alongside that, the question of is it how much we spend or how we spend it?
So my most recent portfolio prior to this one was the Shadow Minister for Finance. So it was my job to stay up late at night worrying about those sort of trade-offs and how on earth you make the budget balance in an environment of rising spending pressures across a range of social portfolios, including aged care, health and the NDIS, delivering increased defence spending, delivering Australians, the tax relief that you think they deserve in a high cost of living environment. I mean, it's a diabolical budget problem and there are trade-offs, and we should be very honest in national security circles when we're all in pretty strong agreement about the importance of higher defence spending, that can't just be done in abstract. There are trade-offs and you have to make sacrifices. And the Australian people are understandably unwilling or reluctant to make those sacrifices unless a very good reason and a very good rationale and explanation is offered to them about why that's the case. And that's why it comes back to that first point about being candid with them about the real true nature of the threat environment and the true nature of our preparedness to see ourselves through that threat environment, because I think they would be willing, if we have an adult conversation with them, take them into our confidence, be honest about those trade-offs. I think they would be willing to contemplate those trade-offs, but not if we tell them that we've stabilised the bilateral relationship with the People's Republic of China and the threat no longer presents of a drastic change of circumstances in the Taiwan Straits or elsewhere in the region, and try and reassure them that that problem is under control when plainly the largest build-up in peacetime since the end of World War II by the People's Liberation Army is not being done just for the fun of it. It's being done for a purpose, and it may well be utilised in the future.
And I will make a comment reflecting what we heard on a very good panel yesterday afternoon where we had, among others, the Chief of Army, the AFP Commissioner, where I drew out a piece of data from our surveys or from the focus groups, which effectively said that there is a lot of confidence in operational agencies from the public in communicating directly with them. As you know, in our surveys, there's less confidence in political voices conveying those messages. So that interesting point that I might begin to wrap up on now, because unfortunately the timing is very tight, is the question of where should this message be coming from? Where should a trusted message about the strategic environment be coming to the public from within this town?
I think that's a very valid point. Politicians have a role in contributing to the public debate, but we don't need to be the sole voices and we don't need to dominate or even necessarily lead the debate, but we should license and encourage others to do so. I think it was Allegra on the previous panel who, called out Mike Burgess's annual threat assessment from ASIO. I think that's been a very positive development in lifting the literacy of the public about those issues. But why doesn't, for example, the ONI Director General deliver an annual speech on the global threat environment, not just the domestic threat environment? Why doesn't the CDF deliver a speech on the changing strategic environment? I think government needs to push these voices out into the public debate because they do have credibility, they do have trust. And we see that in a time of domestic crisis. Every time there's a flood and a fire, politicians are very tempted to, smash glass and send out the uniforms because the public have an inherent trust in the ADF. Well, let's put those trusted voices in the debate, raising the literacy in the community about the challenges that we face so that we can make informed collective choices as a democracy about what's important to us and what we're going to prioritise.
Senator Paterson, I'd love to keep this conversation going. We're deliberately speed dating a lot of, I think, key voices on national security today. So I'm going to end it there. But I should note that Chief of Defence Force is speaking here this afternoon. So we shall see and hear what he has to say. In the meantime, look, thank you again for the work you do. And we really look forward to continuing to engage with you at the National Security College. Can you please join me in thanking Senator Paterson?
Thank you. Appreciate it.